I think it's time to get started again. So right now, I want to ask Lawrence Orenz, Research Director, Gartner Research, Kostin Raju of Kaspersky, Eddie Schwartz, who is the Chief Information Security Officer at RSA, Adrian Stone, Director of Security Response at RIM BlackBerry, and Andy Steingrubel, the Senior Manager of Customer and Ecosystem Security at PayPal. Please take the stage so we can begin our discussion, the implications of global cybersecurity in today's corporate world. Gentlemen.
Okay. Well, I don't know what was more interesting, the last presentation or the restroom layout downstairs. If you haven't been down there yet, you have to check that out. Okay. We had a very interesting panel to open the session this morning. It's great to hear the perspective from Howard Schmidt and Eugene about security at the government level, the economic impact of security globally, some suggestions for raising security awareness within business leaders and even in the school environment. For this panel, we're going to take more of a drill-down perspective. We have some excellent panelists here, a very strong panel from representatives from PayPal, from RSA, Research in Motion, and of course, Kostin Raju from Kaspersky. I'm going to let them introduce themselves in a minute. But we're going to take a more drill-down perspective and focus on the impact of some of the security threats that you heard about earlier, the impact on the corporate environment. So with that, let me turn it over to our distinguished panel.
Introductions?
Introductions, please.
Great. My name is Andy Steingrubel. I'm from PayPal. I've been there for 6.5 years. Done a number of jobs, but a couple of years ago, we realized that with the threats we were seeing in the world, that just looking at our own systems wasn't going to be enough anymore. We needed to start looking outside of our walls, looking at how our customers use our systems and the safety of the whole ecosystem. So I lead our efforts on making a safer internet and improving the security of our products and the usability of them at the same time.
Okay, thank you, Andy. Adrian.
Hello, I'm Adrian Stone. I'm the Director of Security Response and Threat Analysis at BlackBerry. My organization is really responsible for two key functions. One, protecting our products that have reached commercialization. That includes the full suite of products under the BlackBerry portfolio. And then the threat analysis team, which is really looking at kind of forward-looking, what are the opportunities out there that attackers may be leveraging moving forward, so we can roll that back into our SDL process.
Great. Eddie.
I'm Eddie Schwartz, Chief Information Security Officer for RSA. I've been there almost 2 years now. I came to RSA from NetWitness and came around the time of the Secure ID breach. My job is internal security from A to Z, everything from product security, internal security, software as a service, and talking to our customers about it as well, but pretty much own everything in security at RSA.
Kostin Raju, I've been with Kaspersky for 12 years, almost 13, focusing on finding interesting stuff, cyber weapons, targeted attacks, and of course, predicting the future.
Thank you. Kostin, earlier you spoke about you used the term collateral damage to talk about the impact that these cyber warfare, cyber espionage attacks have had on the corporate environment. Let's ask our panel, what are you seeing? Are cyber attacks becoming more prevalent in the corporate space?
We talked coming up, and I thought after Kostin's talk earlier, I would try and be the sunshine guy. I would try and be the optimist about what's going on rather than the pessimist. And so my way of thinking about that is, we have a large number of customers, from large corporations to small, medium businesses to consumers. And it's undeniable that the number of threats are going up, right? The malware counts are sort of off the map. Phishers are ever more active over the last couple of years. And so the threat landscape's definitely getting worse. But interestingly, businesses aren't standing still in responding to them. And so there's like these interesting two competing forces where we see those problems getting worse, but the natural evolution of how companies are doing IT, we heard about bring your own device, we've heard about cloud computing, these things actually are upping the security game or upping the security available to consumers and small businesses through their application, where just by going and moving to a cloud email platform, whether it's Google or Yahoo or whoever, right, one of the providers that does that, you're actually getting a whole bunch of their anti-spam controls and anti-phishing controls and malware filtering and so on, sort of as part of the service, even if it wasn't your reason for moving there. Maybe it was a cost equation. If you didn't want to maintain your own mail servers anymore, or you wanted higher availability than you could get as a small business. And so while the attacks are going up, the sort of evolution of how companies are doing their IT is actually, in some cases, evening that out, such that those security controls that used to be only available to big companies are now actually being democratized and available everywhere. So there's two interesting competing trends in my mind.
Adrian, would you agree? Do you think that the playing field is even, or are the bad guys getting ahead? Certainly seems like there are more attacks. What's your perspective?
I think the curve is constantly shifting, right? Like for every opportunity or every new technology that's coming in that's allowing us to kind of move forward is also creating its own set of challenges, right? I mean, we talk about BYOD as one, and that's brings to host a whole different set of concerns and vulnerability issues that you have to think about, where I think 5 years ago, 6 years ago, the traditional desktop computing world, they acquired that scar tissue, so to speak. So now where some of that's being learned and pulled forward, some of it is now creating unique challenges, especially around social media, and how do we deal with third-party apps in the app space. Like, those are new challenges, and I think a lot of the companies, especially in corporate environments, are still struggling to come to grips with that.
Okay, okay. Eddie, what are you seeing at RSA?
Obviously we deal with many, many organizations of all shapes and sizes. I would argue that I'm not an optimist, I guess, as Andy is. We talk about the attacks that have been publicly disclosed. I would argue that the number of true attacks are at least 5 times that. If you think of an iceberg, the tip of the iceberg is what you see out of the water. What is really happening is 5 times below. I think there's a couple of issues that we heard today which make perfect sense to me. I mean, one, Kaspersky talked about the fact that they're just starting to understand the prevalence of cyber weapons when we know that they've been out there for years, and there are a lot more of them than we understand. Only the best companies that are doing cyber defense today can even begin to understand how to detect and defend themselves against them, and then the vendor space will begin to respond with appropriate solutions. So if you think about that, we've got some catching up to do. I mean that's just one example. I also reflect on the taxonomy that Eugene talked about threats. Breaking them down into nation state and criminals and hacktivists, insiders, and so on. Again, the largest organizations, the smartest security teams have begun to think about and how they need to evolve their security programs to address that threat landscape against what they care about the most. But we're still teaching security people to ISO 27001 in the world and do certain things in a very traditional manner. We need to change the way we're doing things in this industry, and that wave still hasn't caught up with the threat landscape, in my opinion.
Okay, thank you. And Kostun, and what can you add to your comments from before? Let's take this down to the SMB, small to mid-sized business level. What chance do they have in this world of cyber espionage, cyber attacks?
Well, speaking from the security vendors' point of view, what we're seeing is that the cost of exploitation becomes lower and lower every day. So it's really, it's unfortunate to see that it's easier for cyber criminals to infect businesses and, to take advantage of vulnerabilities. And we've actually been working with different companies, like for instance with Adobe, with Microsoft, trying to promote the idea of increasing the cost of exploitation. So we want to make it harder for cyber criminals to break into businesses. And we understand that providing the businesses with solutions might not be enough. That's why at Kaspersky we have this motto, which is we are here to save the world. And the thing, you know, that we're trying to do is that we want to provide a little bit more to our users. We want to actually assure them that in addition to the technologies which we offer, we're also trying to, you know, talk to the vendors, talk to the lawmakers, you know, talk to actually cooperate with the police, trying to make the cost of cybercrime higher. And I think that one of the key issues here is that cybercrime, you know, the cost of entry into cybercrime is becoming lower and lower every day. It's easier for cyber criminals. Well, it's easier for people to become cyber criminals. It's low risk, and you know, it's highly profitable. So my idea is, you know, let's just try to break any of these three points, and that will make the things much better for everyone.
Sure, and that's a very interesting point, to make the barriers to entry or the cost of entry lower. What kind of, have you thought about what kind of metrics we could use to measure our success in that area?
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the best metrics which we would like to think about is the number of cyber criminals which get arrested. So that's like a very good, it's a very good indicator, and it's quite good to see that the you know, the law enforcement, they're quite active and they're catching more and more people every day. And I know the FBI and the Secret Service, they've been doing like great work together with other law enforcement agencies. That's one of the metrics I could think about. The other one is, of course, when you look at the amount of money which gets stolen every day, like, for instance, from banking Trojans. And I know a lot of small and medium businesses, they get hit with banking Trojans, and, you know, money are stolen from them. And if you just calculate the amount of money, the average amount of money stolen from the victims, if you can reduce that, that is also, if not kill it completely, but of course, we know that it's not possible to stop cybercrime, right? Nobody believes that it's possible to have 100% cybercrime-free environment, but if at least, let's say, reduce the amount of money stolen, that's also a very good outcome.
Okay, okay, very good.
Could I
sure.
chime in on that? You know, we've been arguing for a long time. People who live in New York are probably pretty familiar with the murder statistics that have come out this year. You know, and publishing them as compared to previous years. And in the U.S. anyway, the FBI publishes actual statistics every year on the number of crimes all over the country per zip code. So we know for any given zip code how many burglaries there were, or how many assaults there were, or whatever, because we have a whole regime of centralized reporting from every police district to state police to whatever. In other fields like aviation safety or the Centers for Disease Control, we have mandatory reporting so that we can actually tell when there's a flu epidemic, and we can tell what's actually happening. We have surveillance measures, and we can actually measure how it's going, right? We know this flu epidemic isn't quite as bad as certain other ones were, but it's bad in certain ways. And we don't have that in the cybercrime world. We don't have one, consistent reporting, and two, any aggregation of that into one place. So it's next to impossible to know, one, at an absolute level, how things are going. We hear widely divergent opinions on how many dollars are lost every year. The UK put out a study that it was 88 billion to certain kinds of crime, or 88 billion pounds, I think. Last year, maybe it was 37, but the actual number doesn't matter. Is do we have any backing for that? And then we can't tell from that whether things are getting better or worse. So that's one of the big open challenges right now, is getting a reliable way to tell whether what we're doing is actually making a difference.
Yes, Eddie, sure.
Can I expand on that a little bit? Because, and that problem leads to another problem, which is business leaders want to understand what they should invest in IT and what they should invest in security. We in security have done a very poor job of explaining that balance in any meaningful way. So when you talk to a business leader, they understand risk in terms like annual loss expectancy, because the numbers that Andy talked about are unreliable, and we have no actuarial models that we can rely on, like 100-year hurricane data, for example. When you go to point to a survey that says, well, is this much, they go, oh, that's not significant to us. So until we get to a point where we can rely on this data in some meaningful way, it always seems sketchy when we go to talk about the value of security relative to the business value of some asset of importance, whether it's intellectual property or money at a bank, research, whatever it is.
Well, and I think one of the challenges too is the majority of statistics have been really focused on the vendors, right? What are vendors doing in order to raise the bar of security? And what we've seen over and over again, at least through the last couple of years, is the number of CVEs, to me, starts to become less relevant in terms of the amount of threat, because we're seeing over and over again 180 day old issues, 400-day old issues, 500-day issues that are becoming exploited en masse.
Right.
When the vendors had an update, a reputable vendor's had an update. Reputable vendor has given guidance to customers about what they can do. So what those enterprises are doing, what those IT organizations are doing, also I think needs to be represented somehow statistically.
Right, right. I agree, and that issue of vulnerabilities, the CVEs, Kostin, you made a very interesting point about Operation Aurora, how Microsoft was not affected, and the reason they were not hit by that is because they did a very good, they patched their own systems, right? So what advice would you give to enterprises? How can enterprises do better with vulnerability management? How much should they, where does that fit in the equation of balancing cost with letting the business do its thing? Eddie, what's your perspective on that?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting point. I mean, when I came into RSA, we had a big issue that we had just gone through, and I had to think about how do you invest in security, and we had a research firm go out and survey 100 very large organizations on how they invest in security. And interestingly, 80% of the investments are on things that you might call operations and maintenance, things that you do that you can't measure the business impact of, and not enough on other aspects of what you need to do in security. So, it really is creating a better balance across things that that are going to, as Kostin said, make it more difficult for criminals. And, that does include patching and configuration management and, classic defense in depth type of techniques. But then knowing that in spite of that, certain classes of adversaries are going to get past all that. And so you have to invest in military-grade technology. You have to have either people inside your organization or service providers or others that can help you with the detect and deter and destruct phases of the life cycle to really become good at understanding behavior and other components that are downstream of just trying to stop bad things from happening and hoping it'll all go away. So it's a rebalancing act. It's also an understanding, as Eugene said, that or Howard said, that there's no 100% security, and that there are other phases of the adversarial attack where you're going to potentially pick it up, synthesize it, understand it, learn from that. But you've got to invest in those phases downstream. So that's how we've done it, and that's how we're seeing leading organizations do it as well. And certainly the service provider community is responding to that as well.
I think building on that to some extent, if I really had to point out 4 things that I were going to recommend to an organization, and I think back to my years in critical infrastructure, where you'd start to have these kind of esoteric conversations about nuclear power plants and when we can patch them. And one of the things I always came to very clear to me was that the business owners weren't invested in fixing the problem. Like they're very, very focused on their business. So when the security organization comes to them and says you need to patch, they don't understand really they understand the cost of taking a trading floor down for 30 minutes. They understand the cost of taking a power plant offline. But security organizations typically don't do a good job of really communicating the risk and what the impact and implications are of that at a financial level, a cost level. I think the other thing that really organizations need to be focusing on is their own internal SDL. I mean, we've seen the rise of third-party apps. We've seen organizations start to incorporate open source into their own internal systems. Well, we look at what's going on with Java today. And it's not just the Java vulnerability at large. It's how did you write and roll your own apps for your line of business apps, and what are you incorporating in there? So what assets are on your network? What binaries are you incorporating into your line of business apps? And I think for the last 5 or 6 years, IT shops have gotten pretty good about, we've got a patch management process. We have a process to go, issue comes out, we roll the patch, it's 30 days, whatever. But I think some of those other things, and we're definitely seeing it on the Java side, those are now starting to cause some creaks. BYOD. Now you have a whole host of human factors that you have to take care of, because now you actually have, to Howard's point earlier, the human factor, the human assets. What assets are on what are your high value targets? Well, now you have humans that are also now high-value targets. And when you have all of these disparate devices, you have to then manage what vulnerabilities are applicable to each different type of device. So a lot of those challenges now start to permeate through, and I think organizations need to be thinking about that.
So businesses should invest more in application security testing. Is that part of your message?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Okay.
When we look at targeted attacks now, starting to see these homegrown applications that may be vulnerable to those 500, 600-day issues, but that third-party vendor maybe wasn't really kind of vetted through, so to speak, on how they're handling it and tested and held accountable. I think that's a real challenge.
Okay.
Right. I think in the small and medium business space, though, where some of those options are feasible, some aren't, architecture change of how you actually do things can be an important consideration. So if you look at people who are subject to PCI, for example, right? The PCI for the retail industry mandates protection of card data and so on. But what you've seen over time, and I guess I'll put a plug in for us, is when merchants use us and they use a regular checkout flow that isn't one of the credit card based ones, they never get the credit card number because it's only in our systems at PayPal, and so as a consequence, they don't ever have that data that they need to protect. So don't create a security burden for yourself that you then have to maintain. If you never have the data, you never have to store it. If you can outsource that, if you can design an architecture such that that data isn't ever in your own systems, it isn't ever exposed in a certain way. Maybe it goes through a dongle that auto encrypts it, and so it's never on the mobile device or whatever, which is how a lot of the credit card swipe products work now. Then you never have the data exposed in any of those environments, and they become less security sensitive. So you're reducing the attack surface, the number of vulnerabilities, but through the architecture you decide to employ, not just through making those systems harder, but by making them not really part of the equation. And I think that's an important trend we're seeing, is sort of outsourcing that or changing your architecture to reduce the risks you have.
Right. Okay. Okay. Very good. So if I don't have the data in my environment, if I'm not responsible for it, then I can't be attacked for that purpose.
Right.
Okay. Let's shift gears for a minute and talk about the impact of, well, at Gartner we call this the nexus of forces. So the impact of cloud, mobile, and social. And someone earlier on the panel, or earlier in the morning, spoke about, you gave an example about someone sitting on the beach in Maui with their tablet, making a change to PowerPoint and sending that back, and then 20 minutes later they're back to their vacation. That's the impact of what we mean by the nexus of forces. Individually just having a tablet, you can't do that. Individually just having the cloud, you can't do that. But the mobile, the social, the cloud-based coming together changes the way that we deliver IT. And at Gartner, we like to say that whenever we change the way we deliver IT, we need to change the way we deliver security. I'd like to toss that perspective out to the panel, starting with you, Kostin. Do you agree, disagree? What is your perspective?
Well, it's a very deep question. I would say that, well, kids nowadays are extremely smart. And I'm looking at my daughter, and she's 1 year and 8 months, and she's playing on the iPad by herself. And one day I saw that she was about to delete my iTunes account. And I was like, oh my God. And you don't think about this kind of things. You say like, okay, she can play on the iPad, but then she can do all sorts of things, and you don't expect for these things, to be possible in such an easy manner. And it's actually a combination of the fact that people want easy-to-use devices, and the fact that, of course, as Eugene was saying, finding the balance between a device which is secure and one is usable, or a program which doesn't clog the system and protects it, is extremely, extremely difficult. And I remember, in my days from university, we had a number of computers that were running an operating system called VMS. Maybe some people still remember it. And actually, they were forcing us to use some of these things, and nobody wanted to use VMS. I tell you, everybody wanted to use Linux. And the reason is that nobody wanted to use VMS because it was impossible to do anything with it. It was like one of the most secure operating systems. It was used in military, aerospace, but if you wanted to do your, the student homeworks on VMS, you'll have to spend 8 hours instead of 5 minutes that you can do it on Linux. And what happened is that, long term, VMS kind of disappeared. And when I say that, there are some people sometimes in the audience who just stand up and say, "We disagree with you. VMS is still alive." But the number of those people is getting lower and lower. And I can tell you that VMS it's not as popular as Linux, for instance, and that's because people they will always choose the easy-to-use device operating system over the secure one, and this, from our point of view, is creating huge security challenges. And this is one of the biggest things which we're fighting is how to think of all these different scenarios and to deliver a security which takes everything into account and protects people against the unthinkable.
Okay. And let's say, let's toss that back to research in motion. So Adrian, how is research in motion in BlackBerry adapting to this whole force of cloud, mobile, social?
Great question. I mean, as Costin was saying, number one, if it may be the most secure system, but if it's not flexible enough for users to be able to use easily, users aren't going to want to use it. And so when I look at our next generation of products that were actually launched about an hour or two ago, there are things we're doing within the platform now. One of them is BlackBerry Balance, and what that does is create a segmented space on the platform between the workspace and the user space. And effectively, it's transparent to the user. The user really can't tell the difference, but there are protections automatically in place to go make sure that corporate data isn't copied and pasted and leaked out into social networks. We've all seen those emails, right, where it's been a forward on top of a forward on top of a forward, and the next thing you know, you're trailing through, you see someone's email address, and you go, oh my God, I don't think that person really appreciates that. So even within the technology, we're building the type of capabilities to go make sure that users are still able to go send their email to their friends on their personal accounts, but yet at the same time, that data is not leaking over or leaking out corporate information. But to them, it's transparent. I want to hit forward. I'm hitting it to somebody in my friend's contact list that's outside of the corporate address book. Boom, that's going out through Hotmail. That's going out, or name your email provider. Like, those are the type of things that we're thinking about. We're also thinking about, how do you make it easy for the administrators? And one of the challenges, you give a security admin 500 different knobs to tweak, they're going to tweak all of them to the highest style. And so now you've got this kind of user blowback, this user apathy towards the product. Well, how do we make it easy to go defend the corporate IT space, but do it in a way that's reasonable, right? And when I look at BlackBerry Fusion and how we manage the BYOD problem, I think that's huge. Because again, this ubiquitous environment, users get to choose what they want, but yet the corporate IT administrators are able to keep a consistent application of policy all the way across. And so those are the types of things that we're focusing out at a product level, and I think that's important.
Okay, good. And what about at RSA? How is RSA, Eddie, how is RSA adapting to this force of cloud, mobile, social? What type of services are you providing, for example, to help corporations cope?
I was sitting here trying to remember what you called it. A nexus. I was thinking axis of evil, but you said nexus of what?
Nexus of forces.
Nexus of forces, that's right. Seriously, though, so we just we sponsor this thing called the Security for Business Innovation Council, which is the top CISOs, a group of them, and they get together and talk about things they want to talk about. And they actually highlighted cloud, mobility, social media, and big data as the four things that they're seeing their business drive this year. I mean, forget about security problems. Like the CIOs are going, this is what we're doing this year, right? And as Howard said, it's funny because Howard was talking about doing your email on the beach. I seem to remember the Corona bottles commercial on the beach, but I guess the guy had an iPad too. But that is what CIOs are saying. They're saying, well, we're doing all this. The train left the station a long time ago. I think it boils down to two things: control and visibility. At the end of the day, it's going to be a many-to-many situation with cloud. Whether you're talking about authentication, data storage, supply chain, whatever. And in the old days in security, you would try to manage all of those things in your data center in some way, and you would try to get visibility and control over it. Now you're saying, here's all these providers, and they're doing different services for me. They're providing data, they're integrating data, they're providing identity management, and I somehow have to trust these things. I have to, feel like, my identities are handled properly. I have to feel like I can measure compliance for PCI, that I can do SOX compliance, that I can do all the things I need to do there. And that's a challenging world because neither the service provider space in some cases nor the vendors have stepped up to do everything needed in supply chain security management, providing the right hooks for compliance management. We don't have the skills in our organization, either in IT or security, to even address vendor management properly in that space. So this is a big to-do for security teams, is to step up and understand all of that, understand what that attack surface looks like for us, and then provide the requisite process, technologies, and skills to deal with it. And I think it's going to be a fun year for us.
So what do you think has to happen? I mean, what can, let's say, the government do to make things easier? There's the FedRAMP initiative, which maybe some of you are familiar with, where the government has established agencies or organizations to evaluate the security of various cloud service providers and to help government agencies and then also commercial businesses can utilize the findings of these providers and to make their own judgments. So what kind of things can happen to make it easier for the companies to deal with?
So I'm glad you put it in those terms, because I think that if we wait for the government to do anything on any of those fronts, we're going to be waiting for Godot, so to speak. I mean, I think we really need to take initiatives on our own, right? I mean, we as an industry need to innovate. For example, FedRAMP to me, at its inception was simply a replay of third-party assurance with cloud slapped onto it. What I would argue is that what we need to do is say, okay, how do we innovate without constraint to look at problems like governance, risk, and compliance in the cloud? And so, there are things standing up where, for example, people are saying, we can do software as a service in the cloud and bolt on security services that make sense, where vendors such as, some of the payment providers, some of the storage providers and so on, are exposing interfaces that we as security officers can say, oh, I can relate to that information, and it's meaningful to measuring controls, for example. And I think you're going to see lots of things like that. But again, that's just at the inception of things we understand. I do think that it's a watch this space in a lot of these different areas in terms of the way this has to evolve.
Okay, so that's an interesting perspective. Let's get the PayPal point of view there. What type of, how do you reassure your customers that, that you're protecting their security? What type of transparency, visibility do you provide?
So, in our case, I think what's a little different is that, I'm not going to say it without qualification, but we do most of the things ourselves, right? So when you're large enough and you're at scale, then you end up providing most of your core product services yourself, especially in the high tech sector, where what you're providing isn't a commoditized service. It's a fast, innovative, new developments all the time kind of service. Then you're doing that yourself on your own systems, and so you do have a lot tighter control over those kind of things. So I think it's, it is providing transparency to your customers about, what data you're collecting, how you're using it, how you're protecting it, but also when you're in a regulated space and those regulations differ all over the world, then you've sort of automatically got that because it's one of the entries for doing business in that space. On the where government can help though, I'm not, or I said I was going to be sunshine. So that. They've done a few useful things, though, and that aren't to be overlooked on either incentives or bringing people to the table to develop things. So somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but is it SCAP, which is the standard they came out with for security config assessment, doing standardized security configurations across platforms and vulnerability analysis across platforms so that we can actually have meaningful baselines across products to configure them the same, and we can describe those so that we actually get easier interoperability. And as companies, we can say, okay, I have 10 different kinds of things out there, but they all speak the same language. And the government was actually pretty useful in actually driving that standard because they made it a criteria for selling into them. And then if you look at so that's one thing where they can drive standards. The other is liability or actual policy roles, where if you look at what a number of states have done, around data breach legislation and essentially a safe harbor where the data was encrypted. So if a laptop gets stolen but it had full disk encryption on it, then there's no longer a duty to disclose that breach, because by that measure it really isn't a breach. So what you have in that situation is a liability shift or a get out of jail card or something. Call it what you will. It's a safe harbor for those who go and are forward-looking and adopt some of these technologies. And so while the government didn't mandate it in certain states, the adoption rate for full disk encryption was tremendous over the last number of years, precisely because of those regulations that actually reduce the burden on folks for some of what we believe are sort of inevitable events. Somebody's going to leave their laptop behind in a taxi or something. If it's got that security control on it, then you no longer have that disclosure incident. So that you can see that's sort of a market approach to actually driving that rather than a mandate sort of approach. And I'm hoping that we'll see more of that over time.
Okay, good, good.
Can I jump in with just one comment from
Absolutely.
From us? Well, there's one interesting chapter where I think the governments need to do a bit more. And that, I think, is about the disclosure of the leaks of private information. And we see a lot of this, like big attacks hitting different sorts of companies. They kind of try to shove it under the carpet and to avoid a reputation blow by not talking about it, right? So this is an extremely harmless attitude, I believe. And I think that in the US there have been some quite interesting developments in this aspect. The government is pushing, the operators of privately identifiable information to disclose the breaches. And this is, one of the things where I think that perhaps at the global level, not just in the United States, more can be done. And probably here some of the answer lies in the cooperation between the private sector and the governments as well. But some of these leaks, I think, and we're going to see more and more of these leaks and attacks in the future, things such as Anonymous, for instance, they're quite active. I think they're like a very serious problem, and they have to be dealt with.
So you're saying they should be compelled to disclose?
Yes.
Just personally identifiable information, or, for example, intellectual property as well?
What's your opinion?
No, I asked the question. You go first.
Well, I'll give you an example. I'll give you a very interesting example. Perhaps you are familiar with the hack of the Stratfor.
Yeah, sure. Of course.
Stratfor. I was a customer myself,
right.
And my information was leaked, and I was extremely upset when I read that my information was leaked, by just finding the information on the internet without having any kind of notification from the company that my data was leaked, despite the fact they knew they were hacked.
Right.
And that was, an extremely upsetting thing for me, which is why I'm not a Stratfor customer anymore, because they failed to address this issue. Yeah. So I think that probably there are more people out there thinking the same way as me. So yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, because I think that to your point earlier, certainly with the disclosure stuff, the federal government has not gotten around to rationalizing all of the state laws in this space, and it creates complexity for us. But for PII, you could sort of understand where people are on that issue. As you get into intellectual property, it's sort of like, well, if a drug company said, "Oops, we lost the plans for for our next generation, whatever drug," can you imagine what would happen to their market cap? Assuming how the street reacted to it and so on. So there's interesting opportunities to manipulate corporations directly based on the fact that now they're compelled to disclose over potentially some time period. It gets really interesting, as opposed to now where they're not compelled to disclose events that are, they are compelled, as you probably know, to disclose events that would be material to their balance sheet, to the SEC. Mm-hmm. So it's very, very, very interesting.
Well, I think there's an interesting pivot here too. We've talked a lot about disclosure. We've talked about what government regulation can do to actually help protect organizations, or at least create transparency. I think one of the real challenges that we also face, I live day to day in security response, which means I'm working with security researchers all day. I know Andy's company, I know Microsoft, I know we've all taken, pretty strong steps to provide some level of safe harbor to the capability that we can, so that researchers, when they find a vulnerability and they want to disclose it in a coordinated fashion, their goal is to help protect customers just as ours is. We're going to work with them, and we need to, you see these reports every so often, right? Researcher finds a vulnerability, he's kicked out of school. Researcher finds vulnerability, company seeks, the lawyers on them. In Germany, there's been a lot of laws passed that around research tools themselves that have become illegal. And one of the things that I think could help tremendously to help avoid driving this discovery down into the underground areas that then get used and weaponized is being able to create safe harbor for those researchers so they can coordinate and work with us as industry in a fashion that's cooperative and doesn't force them to have to be subversive or worry about whether or not someone's going to come pounding on their door, they're going to get served with a legal notice.
Right. Okay. Very good.
We were talking before the event. I was lamenting that Katie Mazuris at Microsoft beat me to the punch by 3 to 6 months on their vulnerability disclosure policy, which gave legal safe harbor to researchers, because we did one just a little bit after them. I believe it was back in 2007 when it went live, because precisely for that reason, we didn't want people to be afraid that we were going to go after them legally. So we actually published a binding policy on our site that said, report it to us, and we won't send the lawyers after you or call the police on you. We want to know about the issue so that we can keep our customers safe. So I think that's responsive to your previous question of how do we give our customers that confidence? Well, because we're doing everything we can to both do the right thing in the first place, but then if there is a problem, that we find out about it as soon as we can, and we're very responsive to fixing it. And to that end, we just launched in the last little bit a bug bounty program to actually incent researchers to bring them to us instead of trying to use them for some other purpose. And so that's one of those programs that tries to up the bar even more on getting those safety things done to our site before they have any chance to be out in the world and be a problem.
Is that a financial incentive you deliver?
Yeah, it's actually a paid bug bounty program for researchers.
Okay.
I also think that legislation that actually helps drive the industry, again, security response is kind of the view that I see the world. And when I see customers exploited by vulnerabilities that have had updates available for 500 days, 600 days, 1,000 days, there's just a little part of me that dies inside every time, because as a vendor, we've released an update or I've seen another company release an update. And so, especially when I start to look at critical infrastructure, when I look at telco providers, and nuclear power plants, having some legislation there that actually helps those industries move past inherent blocks in their own process to applying security updates, because the application has to get certified for 100 days or 200 days. Being able to see some type of legislation that moves that conversation forward, I'd actually be supportive of that. And typically, I'm very leery of legislation to try and fix technology problems.
But there's where Apple got something right? I'll just show. If you look at the versions queue across Apple's phone and iPads, people keep them up to date because there's new compelling features they want, and the OS tells you automatically that there's a new version for you. And so unlike the legacy problem that Microsoft has had for a long time of people not upgrading off old platforms despite them having new ones available, and in some cases compelling and so on, the number of XP systems in the world is still large. The number of iPhones running OSs that are more than 2 versions back is really low, because people either keep their phone up to date or they buy a new one. And so it's those kind of changes that are sort of architectural to the ecosystem that don't rely on user behavior to do it.
Good. We could certainly pursue that further. But let's shift gears for a minute to talk about bring your own device. We learned earlier this morning that Eugene Kaspersky thinks that BYOD is a 4-letter word.
It is.
But it is. And Eddie, you have some pretty strong opinions too. So let's quickly delve into that area.
Yeah, so I guess, been dealing with BYOD in my job for a couple of years, and I've kind of gotten to the point where I sort of tell people it's kind of a myth, when it comes up, when I talk to my peers in the industry. And the reason I say that is it's not a myth that people are bringing their own device to us or to work or to other companies. The myth part of it is it's more like, give me your device at this point. Because people will show up with the latest and greatest. They want corporate email on it. And my answer to them is that's fine as long as you install this MDM and you install this encryption and you install all of these different tools and which essentially takes control of your device. and gives me the ability to do all kinds of things like GPS tracking and application control and containerization in some cases and different things. So thank you very much for buying the device. Give it to me. So I do understand the bring your own device idea, and I think that's great. But it's, from a security perspective right now, I think that we haven't evolved mobile strategy and we haven't evolved innovation to the point that that you mentioned, where we do have across all platforms, let's say, not,
right.
I mean, you guys obviously do some great innovations, but, to where we can say, we have everything you need where you can bring your own device, do all the fun stuff you want to do, and I can still have the control and visibility that I talked about earlier that I feel like I still need in that space to protect corporate assets. At this point, when you bring your own device, I kind of own it at that point. So it's more like, give me your device.
Okay, would you agree? What's the perspective at PayPal? Is it give me your device? Is it bring your own device? Is it somewhere in between?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny being a Silicon Valley company. I think we've probably dealt with this for longer than a lot of folks, because the mentality of the employees has always been, right, I'm going to get the tools I need to do my job, and so the culture has very rarely been that kind of lockdown, top-down control. I mean, in certain high security areas, your call centers and so on, where people are doing a lot more task-based work, then you've got a lot more options there. But when you've got developers who are trying to innovate, then you've been faced with that challenge for a long time, where maybe you're a Windows-centric company. I've had this at the last couple I've worked at, and people all of a sudden discover there's some great tool on the Mac that they want, or they prefer it for some reason, or find they're more productive. So there's been this tension for a while of how do we allow those innovative tools into the company while providing that kind of control. And there aren't perfect solutions. Unfortunately it's a little bit all or nothing. And if you want to be sure that, for example, anybody who's got access to data that could cause a breach event does have full disk encryption, so that you don't have those problems, then you kind of end up having to make some of those choices that most of the time they don't reduce the functionality of the device. So I think that's the challenge, is where the person may have brought their device. If you get to keep the key characteristics of it, you layer the security on top, but you don't decrease all of the reasons they went to that device in the first place, then you sort of have this win-win.
Right, so if I just can summarize there, the user experience is critical.
Yeah.
Right? Maintaining that, yeah.
I think the user experience is critical. I think also one of the real challenges, and I think Mudge does a great presentation on this. He's now with DARPA, and one of the things that he shows is the layers of complexity, or the layers of tools that you add on top of any given operating system or any operating environment. You start to increase the potential number of vulnerabilities, because you actually have to manage all of these different CVEs potentially. So I think the real key to BYOD is not having a patchwork of different technologies that you have to leverage to manage and centrally manage and centrally configure and defend the device, even if it's give your own device. I think it's having a centralized management capability, right, with a trusted vendor that is going to be able to meet all those needs. And again, shameless plug here for us, but with with our latest generation of the management console, BlackBerry Fusion, you get that. And so you get what we've been doing for years in terms of configuration management, in terms of being able to have ACLs to protect data, and now being able to extend that onto other platforms as well. And so I think that's one of the key things. And again, when folks like yourself have to look at the cost of managing all of that, I think that also becomes important as well.
Right, okay.
Well, no CISO ever says, boy, I sure wish I could buy another piece of software I had to manage and take care of.
Exactly.
I mean,
Exactly.
Right.
Yep.
So.
Okay, so I'm in charge of making sure we stay on track and we're getting the signal. We have about 5 minutes left. Let me wrap up by asking the panel a question. We have a room full of reporters. What's the key soundbite? What are the key takeaways that you'd like, the message you'd like to give as far as what can enterprises and small to medium businesses do overall to improve their security? So we'll start with Andy here, and we'll just go down the line.
Sure. I mean, I think I'd go with two themes. We talked a lot this morning and on this panel about ability to recover from an incident, response, detection, forensics. So, actually having all of the plans in place there so that you can respond to an incident. none of your preventions are going to be perfect. And so being prepared, having the data you need, having the plans worked out. The last time to come up with a crisis management plan is in the middle of a crisis. So doing that. But the second thing I would say is I don't want to understate the value of the move to cloud computing, if you want to call it that, of changing how you do business and looking at your assumptions and rethinking them on, do I have to have that data? What's the right place to store it? Should I be really having somebody else do that? Should I be using a platform where they take care of the patching and I don't have to take care of the patching, right? It's not on my servers, it's at Salesforce or it's at whoever, right? My outsourced mail provider. And now when there's a bug in the mail protocols, they patch it and they patch it right away. And you don't have to have the expertise, you don't have to take the downtime, et cetera. And so rethink a bunch of your assumptions. And it's not just an outsourcing message. It's don't do things that you don't necessarily have to do. Don't be an expert at things that you don't have to be an expert at, because the challenge is scale. And everybody wants scalability, and so go looking for that.
Okay, so a good incident response plan and working with providers that can make life easier for you.
Yeah, that's what I would.
Okay. Adrian?
From my side, I mean, Andy stealing my thunder a little bit. I mean, incident response, I think, is a cornerstone, not just in an individual way, but when you really look at incident response, it's part of a larger SDL process. And I think any SDL process is going to incorporate vulnerability management. It's going to incorporate those type of architectural decisions that Andy is talking about. Do you keep it in-house? Do you build it out? Do you build mitigations in? It's going to incorporate an incident response process that isn't just the engineers or corporate security driving that process. It's involving your communications teams. It's involving the business stakeholders and getting them all invested. So, really for me, and I can't preach this enough, it's having a sound SDL process in place, because I think that's kind of all-encompassing in what you do in your security strategy.
Okay, thank you. Eddie?
I agree with everything that Adrian and Andy just said. In my mind, it's about big data transforming security in 2013. If you think about Nate Silver and what he's done with analytics, it's about addressing the unknowns that were talked about earlier. It's the uncertainty of what is out there that we don't understand, and starting to figure out how we understand that uncertainty that will give us precision in terms of preventing and detecting future threats. So it really is about not living on an island, getting more data from Kaspersky, RSA, from BlackBerry, from everybody we can, bringing it together with our data, and then getting the right analytics, the forensics, everything we need, and getting that whole stream right. And so big data is going to transform all of us. Either we do it ourselves or we find providers to do it for us.
Okay, Kostin?
Well, speaking from the point of view of the lessons we've learned by looking at these big incidents from the last year, like Flame, Gauss, I would say just a few words: mobile device management, encryption, and patch management. These are actually sometimes, people say they're like big words, but actually sometimes they're extremely easy to put into practice. In addition, a solid password policy. So altogether, these things, they may sound more complicated than they really are, but let me give you just a very easy example. Few people know that perhaps, for instance, Stuxnet doesn't work on Windows 7 64 bits. So like a very easy advice, just, update all your Windows installations to 64-bit Windows. And so, just out of the box, you are automatically protected against a large class of threats. But of course, combine that with patch management, mobile device management, encryption, and suddenly the situation is a lot better.
Okay, thank you. We're out of time now, but this has been a very informative session. I want to thank all of our panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you.